I call it the hamster wheel effect. They see no options available to them because their thinking process is so focused on the object of their burnout or trauma or stress. To them, it seems like there's no
alternative
options. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not that you can't see the end of the tunnel. I mean, you can't even find the tunnel. But that's the beauty, really, of divergent thinking, is that it comes naturally. You haven't got to create it. You're just got to awaken it. That awakening can come from releasing those boundaries that are keeping your thinking along these convergent lines. If they're going to move on, they've got to stop doing things the same way.
Dr. Andre Walton, thank you for joining me on Success Matters podcast. You've got a very rich and varied history in terms of your career. You have a PhD in social psychology. You're an inventor. You've got patents. You invented a new microphone. You were an entrepreneur. You've just done a TEDx talk in Alaska. I mean, there's so many things. Where do we begin? Where does your story start?
I don't know. I mean, as you say, I am not exactly the poster child for my high school career counselor. I mean, it's just my career has gone all over the place. But the common thread really is creativity. I was born of very creative parents. I call them parents because it's mother and father, but we never actually lived together as a family. But they were both very, very creative people, as is my half sister, actually. And that kind of interest in creativity, the good sides of it and the negative sides of it, have really been a thread throughout my life. As you mentioned, I started inventing things in the 20s, and in grammar school, actually, I was doing all the sciences, physics, maths, applied maths, and then promptly left school and got a job as the graphic designer for a publishing company. So, it's like my parents, I had a rather loose connection with social norms. But that's just I went back to become a physicist, actually. But so I've been all over the map in terms of kind of the type of jobs that I've done. Well, I went at the end of my entrepreneurship phase of my career, which was 15 years of building businesses around, as you mentioned, a microphone and also a system for measuring clinical ultrasound, which is a strange, sometimes there were conferences in the same city, and so I'd go to sort of, putting on my Beatle wig to sell my microphones to the pop community, to putting on the shirt and tie and being with the medics in the ultrasound community, so it was a little bit of a strange deal. But once that was over, I consulted for a while, and then I went back to school, as we say in America. Went back to school to do a PhD in social psychology, and my focus was organizational level creativity. So, that was another continuation of this kind of strand of my DNA. And really, there are sort of three strands of my DNA. One is business. I've just always been very interested in business from a mechanics point of view, from a motivation point of view, and practically because I didn't find it terribly easy to work for other people. I was always sort of frustrated, or, there was always some sort of, not necessarily I could do it better, but, why are you employing me when, you could be, I'm not terribly interested in running errands and sticking stamps on envelopes, So, so that's, I think those two, creativity, business, entrepreneurship, and really the third one is teaching, coaching, spreading the word about things, that kind of area.
Okay. So you went from doing scientific studies at school, becoming a graphic designer, then going back to science with being a physicist.
Yes.
And then creating this creative space around microphones and the like. I suppose that all kind of comes together, right? When you stop and think about it in that way. But I'm sure when you were looking forward, as it were, planning your next move, this probably was a little bit, not necessarily planned directly, but it kind of, did you fall into it, or did you actually have a solid plan that this is what I'm going to do?
Oh no, there was not really any hint of a plan. Just as opportunities arose, I just felt an obligation to sort of take them wherever they would lead me. And so, when I was in the graphics job, by a bizarre set of experiences, which I won't bore you with right now, but I actually ended up being a journalist. Right. Because my editor left. The boss actually didn't realize he'd left. And 3 months later, when the magazine was coming out, he's like, sort of, well, where's Richard? Where's the editor gone? I said, well, he left 3 months ago, actually, because you fired him. This guy made a tradition of firing people, and then they kind of knew what was going on, so they just turned up on Monday morning anyway, and they just sailed on. Well, this time around, my editor, Richard, decided he wasn't going to do that. He was actually going to consider himself fired because he was kind of sick of the whole thing. So, so the bottom line was that after that series of, and he said, well, what are we going to do now? I said, well, you seem to be very happy with the magazine over the past 3 months, and you haven't had Richard there. So if you want to keep me around, you better make me editor. So that was how I moved into writing and journalism. And that is really another common thread. I mean, as I think I mentioned to you, I just have a new book out for coaches, really, about creative thinking, which I'm pleased to say went to international bestseller in the past couple of weeks. So that was a bit of a shock. But so I just have got that became a bit of a passion, really, writing. And so,
right,
and it's such a very rewarding experience, writing. I think it clarifies your thoughts. It just helps your whole sort of metabolism, mental metabolism, work better in clarifying your ideas and that kind of stuff. So that's really another thread that has become increasingly important for me.
And on the point of writing, when you talk about writing, do you mean physically writing pen to paper or electronically keyboard onto screen? Because I find personally that pen to paper is a lot better for me than keyboard onto screen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and there is, by the way, science to show that the physical act of writing has a different set of neural pathways than the physical act of tapping a bunch of keys,
right?
Which I think is kind of interesting. So I do both. If I'm in the early stages of my book and I've got most of the thoughts in my mind, the rest of it will be actually handwritten. And that I find is, first of all, the pace is very nice. The pace of you concentrating on your words and writing them down. There's a sort of continuity which I find clarifies things. But then there's the sort of more boring part of, either dictating or using the keyboard to actually kind of get the stuff down in a way that you can use modern technology to then format it and that kind of stuff. But I totally agree. There is a bit of a magic. In the same way for me that, having a physical copy of a book has, some great assets too. I mean, to take a book with a whole bunch of, the little sticky note, tabs, and put little notes on them and then highlight the book. I mean, my book's a mess by the time I've read it. And it's just, but that act helps me actually remember things in the book. Otherwise, if I do it on Kindle, I think, well, that was a great point he made. Now, why did I do it? Because I didn't highlight it or click it at the time or anything. So, I think there's definitely a place for that kind of tactile process.
Yeah, I'm very much with you. I was reading a lot on Kindle or Kindle app, and I found that, particularly when you're reading a book about self-help or development or a business book, you want to flick back to something. It's quite hard to flick back to where you wanted, where you had that thought. Whereas in a paper book, you kind of like flicking and think, oh yeah, that's, I don't know, there's a visual marker of some sort, even if you haven't necessarily marked it.
Yes.
that says, oh, that's the section that was in. It's kind of just
Yeah,
gives you that sort of perspective.
absolutely.
So this is quite a good segue, really, to what you've written about in that book, which is creative thinking. And when we were preparing for this call, you were talking or explaining about two different ways of thinking, the convergent and the divergent thinking processes that we have. I suppose for the benefit of our listeners, could you explain what you mean by that, and how does that manifest itself, and what should we be aware of?
Well, I think in terms of how it manifests itself, it's and by the way, much of this is now confirmed by fMRI imaging. So, for those who may not know what that's all about, we all know an MRI. You'd go in for an MRI after you've fallen over, smacked your head, or done anything else really, and then so you've got an image, but that image is a slice of time. fMRI is interesting. It's actually functional MRI. And what is so fascinating from my perspective is if you're doing the fMRI of the brain, you can actually have a look at what neural pathways are lighting up across the cross section of the brain when the person's thinking something specific. So you can say, okay, have a think about. I'm going to give you a little mathematical problem to solve here, and you give them a simple mathematical problem, and certain pathways illuminate across the brain. And then you say, well, I'm going to give you a creative thing to think about now. How many ways can you think of that you can use a shoe? What uses can you put for a shoe? How many? And so that, which is, by the way, called the divergent thinking test. And that's used by social psychologists like myself as a proxy for measuring creativity.
Okay.
If you ask somebody, I want you to do something creative, it's very difficult to quantify that. Whereas, quantifying the number of unique things people can think of to do with a common object is fairly easy. So, it's as a rough kind of measure, that's what it is. And you can see then a whole different set of neural pathways illuminating in the brain when you're asking somebody to do that creative task. So physically, there are these two different ways of thinking. In practice, the word divergent thinking was really meant to be because of the concept that if you're thinking creatively, your mind has to be open to a lot of the possibility of a lot of solutions. So a little bit as if somebody teleported you to a totally different country or whatever, a totally different environment, and you're dumped in the middle of things that and things will look sort of roughly similar, but they operate in very different ways. And the first time I traveled to India, and you're in a three-wheeler taxi vehicle, and you're riding right long next to an elephant. These are things that you might sort of have a dream about and think that's a weird dream. Well, this was reality. So but in that sort of circumstance, really, you're opening your mind to all kind of possibilities. You're seeing things, and you think, wow, that's an interesting way of doing that, but it seems to work. So that's a very divergent way of thinking. The opposite of that is the analytical, deductive sort of processes that in the developed world we tend to adopt as we become socialized adults. And the thing about, and the reason for that is that we're surrounded by very complex circumstances compared to what the brain would have been used to even 200 years ago. And a lot of those are technology related in some way. And so what tends to go on when you think analytically is that you sort of wind the microscope up to a greater magnification. People use the phrase drilling down. And when you drill down as such, basically it's the opposite of that divergence. It's convergence. So you're taking this particular thing, and it could be a very trivial problem. How do I get through this particular web page in order to pay this bill? Or it could be something much more complicated. And
Hmm.
so, that, and one of the consequences of this is that if you get used to doing a lot of convergent thinking, you end up like a horse with blinkers or blinders, depending where you come from. And so,
Yeah.
your field of view of the world becomes very restricted. And when I was first coaching people who had anxiety, stress, burnout to some degree, it was very evident to me that that was a common trait in all those kind of occurrences. So people, you'd be talking to somebody for maybe an hour's coaching session, and you get through the whole hour, you never manage to get off the issue of this person's trauma, this person's
Right.
burnout, and I call it the hamster wheel effect. They
Hmm.
they see no options available to them because their thinking process is so focused on the object of their burnout or trauma or stress, that to them it seems like there's no um,
There's
really
no
no
alternative.
options. Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not that you can't see the end of the tunnel. I mean, you can't even find the tunnel. I mean, it's like,
Right. Yes.
so that's really, and it's the more you kind of digest it, the more powerful this convergent versus divergent concept becomes. And, when we first spoke this morning, that was one of the first things that you commented on. So it obviously made an impact.
Yes.
And I think um, that whole process led me to start using creative thinking with my burnout clients. And it was very, very interesting because you'd be sort of 15 minutes into the conversation, and it was all about the burnout and so on and so forth, all burnout related conversation. And the first time I tried this, I just intuitively changed the topic immediately to, well, when we first talked, you were very interested in videography. You said that had become a bit of a passion of yours. And so 5 minutes later, I'd guided the conversation onto my client's um, chosen recreation of a few years ago. And,
Hmm.
he was really quite passionate about videography. And so one of the tasks that I gave him to do was to find an interesting kind of topic, something that would at least have interested him a couple of years ago or whatever, and to shoot a video of what was going on there.
Yes.
And he got, he got sort of quite animated about this whole process. Well, the next session we had was just incredibly different to the previous one. I mean, we had a brief conversation about the burnout thing, but not immediately. The first thing he wanted to do was get the chip from his camera, put it into his computer, and show me the video that he'd made, which happened to be of
Right.
a friend of his who was doing a track meet. And this friend actually came, I think, third in this track meet. And he was going to shoot this video and give it to his buddy, edit it, whose birthday it was, like the following week, just after our session, actually, a couple of days later. And, he was just really animated. And he'd had a lot of excitement doing it. He'd started the editing, and that was exciting. And it was, that was a real turning point for me as a coach and for him as a burnout client.
Hmm.
And that just really, um, I swore that I was going to really analyze that whole process. And it's from that I came out with these various concepts regarding the two ways of thinking. And more to the point,
Hmm.
connected them to a useful therapy.
Yeah. That's what you said there. I mean, when I studied NLP, neuro linguistic programming, and one of the techniques is to do a pattern interrupt. So someone's on that hamster wheel, and you throw something left field at them, or a conversation, and just as you were talking, it reminded me of a conversation I've been having with a coachee, where she was very deep in the weeds of her financial situation. And I said to her, well, actually, what I'd like you to do is write me a song. And so it kind of was somewhat left field to her, but she had expressed a passion for music and a passion for songwriting. So the next time we met, she'd written this song. She was nervous, but the song was the thing that kind of started, and that just changed her whole outlook. So I can very much see how that works. What about though in a big organization? Because when you introduced the concept to me of, becoming very narrow in your focus and that kind of convergent thinking in a big organization, you end up with convergent thinking. I think you end up with silos. You
Yes.
end up with, that's not my department, that's your department, that's not my responsibility,
Yeah.
that's your responsibility, all of that. How do you solve for that? How do you bring that divergent thinking into a big corporation?
Well, I think it really depends from circumstance to circumstance. But I mean, now in Silicon Valley, you're seeing a much more enlightened view of the power of creativity, not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
creative thinking per se. That's probably one level further on. But so what you're finding, for instance, is a business that will have a music room. And, when you need to, it doesn't need to be your lunch break or something. It's just whenever you see the mood, you can go down there and, tinkle with the keyboard or the guitar or whatever it is, and that's acceptable. Or, if you happen to be a tennis fan and it's, the US Open is play, well, that would be on a Sunday, but, something that you want to really see, you can take time off and do that. So that kind of relaxation of rather artificial boundaries can
Yes.
itself begin to encourage divergent thinking. I mean, divergent thinking is not something we have naturally. When we're kids, we're born into a world where we have no history. We've got no, and so the neural pathway that we, as adults, if we come into a new situation, our subconscious sort of disappears off to look at its memory banks and comes back and says, yes, you've actually encountered a similar situation before. And then you make decisions based on that past process. Now, that is quite a convergent kind of way of doing things. But that's what we do as adults. Well, as kids, we don't do that. So,
Yeah.
you're if I'm with my grandkids, for instance, I remember one time they were, doing their usual process of coming up with new, exciting new ideas to present me with, and my computer mouse, would suddenly be a cell phone. The vegetable strain that became an ancient warlord's battle helmet. And so, that's that process of divergent thinking is something we're born with. And if you think about it, without having any history, without having, it's like putting a puzzle piece into a jigsaw puzzle. You've got this new bit of information. You're trying to make sense of your world, and you're trying to find where this thing fits. Well, that's you've got no sort of picture on the box to guide you, and that doesn't come until later when you become adults and you've got that background of back information. So that's the beauty really of divergent thinking, is that it comes naturally. It's not, you haven't got to recreate it. You haven't got to create it. You're just got to awaken it. And so that awakening can come from releasing those boundaries that are keeping your thinking along these convergent lines. And so once you get rid of those boundaries, you're on the path to at least getting a balance. And I'm not suggesting everybody should be majority, divergent thinking. What I'm suggesting is that the balance between the two ways of thinking needs to be restored.
Okay. And do you have any tips for someone who is, working in the corporate world, have been in the corporate world for most of their career, and potentially that's kind of all they can see is what they've got in front of them, to have that more divergent thinking? Because oftentimes there's people want to make a change, but there's a fear of letting go because that's what they know. That's kind of the safe element, if you like, for them. And yet there's this other world they could be going into, but where there's that more openness, but they can't make that step. So are there any tips or hints or tricks you could give?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we with no matter what we're doing in the corporate world, we're making decisions. And the first thing you can do is to start making those decisions consciously, and have a look at every decision you're making. Initially, this is a lot of effort and a lot of extra time, but it's worth pursuing. And if you come across a temptation to make a knee-jerk decision, stop yourself and say, okay, what options do I actually have? And the corporate world is really jam-packed full of knee-jerk decisions. And
Yes.
you can see this all over the place. I mean, one of the advertising companies I was working with a while back, they had a string of launches for their clients' products that were at best mediocre. I mean, they struggled to not use that word, but it was very difficult because they just didn't go well. And the bottom line was, they just got this whole kind of pair of railway tracks that they followed to launch the product. The world had moved on from where those railway tracks had followed it, and to actually get them to understand that they need to, if they're going to move on, they've got to stop doing things the same way. And it's a simple, very obvious message, but it's so intuitive to the developed country mind. To actually just kind of use that process of using the previous scenario to guide the next one.
Yes. Yeah, I see AI as that sort of moment where businesses have been doing things, individuals within businesses have been doing things in a certain way, and AI now is there. And how do you open your mind to what you can do with AI and how AI can support you and help you versus seeing as a threat, or just carrying on along those parallel lines that you've been carrying on for the last 10 years or so?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember an embarrassing number of years ago now when IBM was still making, PCs for the home.
Mm-hmm.
There was an ad, or the home and the office, before they pulled out of the PC business and only did servers. And one of the last ads they had was, "No one ever got fired for choosing IBM." That was the ad. And the clear implication was, it doesn't really matter what else is on the market. Your job will not be on the line if you choose IBM, because it, Big Blue's got its name on the front. And it's just stuck in my mind because, first of all, what a really dreary message to convey to a potential customer. And secondly, of course, it hinges around this habit-forming process that we've been talking about, whereby you make decisions according to what you did last time, or what other people have done, what your expectations are. I mean, it's just, I'm not going to think about any other possibility. I'm just going to order IBM, I mean, it's just, so that, it's a very deep-rooted process in larger organizations.
Absolutely. So Andre, as you know, this is called Success Matters.
Yes.
As you've been through this big journey on your, in your life journey, what does success mean to you, and how has that view of success changed over time?
Well, what a difficult question to answer. I think I don't think success has ever really been the achievement of a specific goal to me.
Okay.
I mean, there are exceptions. I was sort of over 50 when I got my PhD. And so that might be an exception, because that was a very specific path with a very specific endpoint. I think in general, though, I think success has meant the achieving of a body of knowledge which is really interesting, and associated with that, achieving a body of experience which is really interesting. So whether it was building concrete boats in Greece or teaching scuba diving in Egypt, the actual process led me to a sort of a different place in my mind. And I very, very early on in my life, I and I don't know what inspired this thought at all, but I thought one of the worst things that could possibly happen to me would be to get to an old age where I knew that life was going to be over fairly soon, and to look back and say, God, what have I done with my life? Question mark, in a sort of very dreary, non-achieving kind of fashion. So, and I don't
Yes.
know why that occurred or whatever, but it's always stuck with me. And I think everything that I've done, in a sense, has been an attempt to avoid that, what I perceived as being, the worst possible outcome.
Right. Yeah. And that advice is usually given to people, but not many people actually take it on board. And, it's like, yeah, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll make that change, in the future. And yet that's exactly what, the deathbed exercise is, if you like. What do you want people to
Yeah.
remember you for? What do you want your legacy to be? And what do you want to have been remembered for? So yeah, it's a very sage piece of advice, and you took it on very early to think about what your life should look like.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a few years between us, Sanjay, and I think when I was, for instance, in my early teens, it was still a very common phenomenon that somebody in England anyway, that somebody would get to retirement age, which was probably 65, and by 67, 68, they were probably dead.
Yeah.
And, that process, which happened to my first stepfather. And so,
Mm-hmm.
that there was never any suggestion that your job should be anything other than highly secure.
Right.
And the notion that you should, sort of change your profession midstream was definitely frowned upon.
Hmm. It kind of goes back to the nobody got sacked for buying IBM type of thing, right? That people they bought IBM because it was secure for them to keep their job. That then meant that there wasn't that need to look elsewhere.
Yeah.
So Andre, I have a tradition in my podcast that I ask a previous guest to ask a question for my next guest. My previous guest asked this question. She said, "What's your favorite item in your desk drawer?"
Oh, well. She hasn't had the misfortune to look at my desk drawer,
Okay.
which is only marginally messier than my desk surface, I have to say.
Okay.
Gosh, that's a very difficult question. I wow, I don't know how I would go about answering that, really, other than the fact that
I can visualize you rummaging through the drawers right now in your mind.
Yes. I think actually, I have to say it's my passport.
Your passport.
Yes.
Okay.
Which I keep in my desk drawer. And I think if I was deprived of that passport, I think I would feel very, very, very lost. I mean, even if I don't, even if I don't travel a great deal these days. I mean, I was in Alaska last week, but in terms of sort of real discovery traveling, I think being deprived of the ability to just at a whim go to some different part of the world, I think that would be rather depressing for me.
Yeah, I can understand. I mean, you've already mentioned Greece, Egypt, Alaska. You're born in Britain, but you live in the US right now. So I can see travel is a large part of what you do and your life. And I tend to agree with you, actually. If I lost the ability to travel, that would have a profound impact, even if I was never planning on traveling, but I really enjoy traveling. So that would be quite important. Do you have a question for my next guest?
Yes. If you look at the many forks in the road of your life, which one of those produced the most interesting options?
Okay. If you look at the many forks in your life, which one of those produced the most interesting options? Okay. So, I mean, for me, a fork suggests an A or B option. But now you've thrown this out there as which produced the most interesting options. So it's now A, B, C, D, or E maybe as options, not necessarily just the one. So what was the moments in your life that produced, say, the most interesting options?
Um, well, for me, I think most options have most sort of options of any consequence require the concentration between two different options. That's why I sort of think of it as forks.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most frustrating options was when the EU offered me the chance to go to Japan for 3 years, work with small businesses, learn Japanese. The EU was very keen on trying to get business people from the UK into Japan to really understand their MO in the business context. And I just couldn't do it because my business was growing. I had to focus on my business. And, I had to explain to them that, thank you for the offer, but there's no way I can drop my business for 3 years and do this. But, it's a country I love. And I love immersion as a concept.
Yes.
And I spent some while trying to figure out if there's any way I could possibly make that work. And I concluded that there wasn't. But that was the most frustrating option, I think.
Wow. Yeah, that would have been an amazing thing. I mean, if at that time, right, maybe the technology and everything wasn't quite in the way in which it is today, but if that option came to you today, do you think you would go for it, given that you can remain in touch with people at the drop of a hat versus, I don't know how long ago this was, but previously you didn't have the same communication options you have now?
No, this was back in the 1970s, so we were a long way from.
Oh, right.
This was many, many years before BIE, before the internet epoch.
Yes.
So now I think I don't know. I think a lot of business these days still needs to be hand-on when you're at the beginning.
Right.
It would still be a challenge, but it would be a lot closer to saying absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, indeed. So on that note, we're at the top of our time now. So thank you very much for the conversation. It's been really interesting. I've enjoyed the chat that we've had. If people want to get in touch with you or find out more or buy your book, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
My email, dr.andre@plan4change.org. Dr. Andre at planforchange.org.
Plan for Change. Okay.
Thank you so much,
Sanjay.
Sanjay. It's been a real pleasure.
That's great. Thank you. To find your success, contact me at info@successmatterscoaching.com. That's info@successmatterscoaching.com.